All right, I think we'll get started. Very nice to see you all here. I'm happy to welcome you to our 10th conversation this semester. I'm Dietrich Neumann. I'm the director of the John Nicholas Brown Center for Public Humanities and Cultural Heritage. And as you know, we've started this series sort of on a mission to make this house more available to all the different publics in Providence on the east side and on our campus and other parts of Providence. And it's working really well and it's great fun. We've had a wide variety of artists and writers and thinkers. We have the mayoral candidates for Providence coming up in the following weeks and more writers. And tonight is really, for me, a great highlight in our lineup. As you know, the jewelry artist, Priya Himatsingka. And it's really a great pleasure to introduce her and have her introduce us to new ideas and her experiences. She's a jewelry designer, as you know from our poster, and she was born in Calcutta, India, and then moved to Bangalore, and then finally came to the United States to study. And she went to New York City. I imagine the culture shock that you experienced probably at that point, but you had traveled, I guess, before, and it was not entirely new, but came to New York City to the New School, Parsons, and studied there, and then I assume wasn't challenged enough, and you went to NYU and got a degree in philosophy and photography. And then she came to Rhode Island and joined the jewelry department here at the Rhode Island School of Design. And you'll hear more about all of this when she talks about her experience. She has a studio here in Providence, or rather it's actually in Pawtucket, right over the Providence line. Very beautiful, and you'll see that too. And an amazing store on Hope Street called PH Factor, after her initials. And as you'll see, her amazing work, it's really, the work of an artist and a craftsperson, brings together and responds to the different cultures of India and the United States, of tradition and modernity. It emphasizes craft and process, and it's just incredibly beautiful. So please help me welcome Priya Himatsingka.
I'm so honored to be here. Thank you, Dietrich, and thank you to Brown for hosting today. I've been to a few of the conversations in previous weeks, and they've been really amazing. So my name is Priya Himatsinka. I'm a jeweler. I own a brick and mortar store on Hope Street called PH Factor that he just mentioned. My jewelry line is called Himatsinka Jewelry. I've been doing my jewelry for about a little over 15 years now. I consider myself an honorary Rhode Islander now. I've lived here for 24 years. I moved here in '97 to start at RISD, and I absolutely love Providence, all the vibrancy, culture, energy, history that the city has to offer. So I'll be talking about a few things tonight. I'll be talking about my background, my work, and then how my background, my heritage influenced and continues to influence my work. So a little background of me: I was born in India. I moved to New York when I was a little over 17 and a half. I'd studied philosophy, photography at the New School. And as Dietrich said, I didn't enjoy it as much as I imagined I would. So I eventually transferred to NYU, where I graduated from. And then I moved to Providence to pursue jewelry. So there's a little bit of an odd story about how I got to the jewelry department. This is pre-internet. I don't actually recall ever getting the phone number of the jewelry department or contacting them any which way. But one morning, I was living in New York still. I found myself on the phone with the head of the department at RISD, and I honestly don't know how I got to that point previously. So I convinced them to let me come here. I came here to meet with them. I started out as what they called a special student back in the day for one semester, just to see if I liked it. And then eventually, a semester later, I decided I wanted to enroll at RISD to study jewelry. I did a second bachelor's, not a master's, because I didn't have any prior experience in jewelry at all. So I started in '97. I've been here since. I would say that between philosophy, photography, jewelry, nobody in their right mind should pursue those as degrees. Just a cautionary tale for anyone who has kids. Not the brightest idea. So, but here I am. So I want to start with something that sort of leads my life and in my design, my art, and almost everything that I do. And this is something I wrote many years ago, and I abide by it. So I'll let you read it for a second. And visually, because I'm a visual person, philosophically and artistically, this sort of guides how I do my work. And I truly believe that the power and the energy of all of our aesthetic choices, whether it's architecture, the way we live, the clothes we wear, everything not only influences us, but also reveals something pretty fundamental about us. So in as much as we choose, whatever it is we choose to either reveal or hide, it's a pretty fundamental, integral part of our existence. So I'm going to show you a couple of quick slides just to give you a primer on the kind of jewelry that I do. This is a composite of some pendants that I have made. And this quickly are 2 shots of my store on Hope Street, which has my jewelry, but also other products from all over the world. So I'm going to start with a little background on me. This is one of my favorite pictures. I was born in Calcutta, as Dietrich mentioned. It's nicer when the room is darker. That's Victoria Memorial. It's one of the better known monuments in Calcutta, the city that I was born. I have personally a little bit of a complicated history with the city. I moved out of there to Bangalore when I was 11. At the time, I don't think I would say I cared for it very much. And up until I would say a few months ago, wouldn't say I've cared for it very much. But all of a sudden, I have a yearning to not only re-explore it, but I'm very nostalgic for what I didn't explore as a child. And I realized, so it's something I keep in mind as an artist and as a business owner. But I realized middle age does funny things to you, where all the stuff or many things that you didn't like when you were growing up, you grow up and you suddenly realize, well, they weren't so bad. So when I can, the next time I go to India, I really do want to spend a little bit more time in Calcutta exploring the parts that I didn't as a child. So this is, I'm using visual images as sort of a launching pad. If anybody has a question about, anything that you see, feel free to ask. So I chose this painting, which I saw at one of the palaces in India a couple of years ago when I was there with my kids in the South. And what struck me about this is that it has this kind of a peculiar blend of the West and India. This is by a famous painter called Ravi Verma in the 19th century. And he did a lot of, he's an unusual artist, you can look him up. But this painting in particular spoke to me because, again, it's this very unusual blend of East and West, where he's clearly influenced by Western styles, but it's in the Indian tradition and the subjects are Indian. And I chose this because to some extent it shows how it straddles 2 cultures. And I feel like in my life, even though I haven't lived in India for over almost 30 years, it's still, both cultures are very part of my life. So I've lived in Providence for a long time. Before that, I was in New York. I travel a fair amount, but clearly India is still part of my design, my living, my life. And this blends like the 2 parts that I admire and respect. So this is a picture I took a few years ago, and I wanted to start out by saying, usually when we think of India, most people, including myself, we see the opulence, the maximum everything. There's hustle and there's bustle and there's chaos and everything is larger than life and louder than life and all of that. And some of these pictures will show you, this is a parking lot, believe it or not, in the middle of the city. Nobody really even stops to consider how amazing it is, but there's cars parked under, which I don't think I had a shot of that. Other, typical or more typical images of India that you would see are, this is a store that sells vintage prints and vintage items, I suppose. This is a shop in Calcutta on a sleepy morning. They sell decorations for the house. This is another image from Calcutta, which again shows you the more when I say opulent, not necessarily in riches, but just very busy part of the country that usually is what you would see. This was on a very ramshackle house. There was a decrepit painting that I thought was amazing that was crumbling, but quite beautiful. And this is a scene from the Mysore Palace, which is one of the most opulent buildings I've ever seen in my life. This is up north, another palace. And this is just an image that I like, but I also wanted to point out that there is, in the bustle and the humdrum and the noise that that we usually hear from India, there is a tradition of simplicity and in terms of aesthetic, certainly a quieter aesthetic that tends to be overshadowed by what's very busy and loud. And I pulled some photos out it's not the easiest thing to find because I haven't been back in a while, but it's not that India doesn't have a tradition of quiet or simple or, very pared down. It's just not as easily accessible. These are different scenes from homes or places that I visited. This is a store in India, which is a new store, but they've done an interesting job as a departure from the other types of stores in India. So I'm going to move from there to just sort of give you an idea of the scope of my life in India and what I end up seeing. I'm going to take you through a little tour of my jewelry life. So that is my jewelry brand. This is my studio in Pawtucket. This is where we make all the jewelry. And that's one of the nice things about living in Providence is that we have access to these amazing old mill buildings that are still relatively inexpensive and able to be used. So that again is our studio. That's us working there. So in my jewelry line, we tend to work mainly in silver and gold. And one of the things that I've loved about jewelry is that even though there's other disciplines, like whether it's woodworking or furniture or ceramics or even cooking that use pretty pared down basic elements, like a furniture maker might use wood, which is pretty basic, jewelers use an element. And it's always fascinated me that I actually get to work with an actual element. There's, even if it's alloyed, it's still alloyed with other elements. So in terms of materials, you can't get more basic than that. And there's something kind of cool about going to that level of intrinsic material. Also that it's intrinsically precious is kind of a nice feeling. So pretty much everything that we use in the studio or in terms of our materials, again, unlike clay or wood, are intrinsically precious, which is kind of a fascinating thing. Jewelry techniques have not changed. Jewelry making techniques have not changed in years, or almost like certainly hundreds of years, but sometimes even a few thousands of years. These are just, so we use a lot of the tools that may have, changed a little bit over the years, but not really. It's most cultures, unless you're talking about Belgium and the very high-end fancy commercial jewelry, most jewelers still use very ancient techniques that have been the same for 2,000 years or longer. And RISD actually has a very old German tradition of teaching jewelry, which hasn't changed at least since in the last 500 years. And most of what we end up doing is exactly how it was done about 500 years ago. This is just the motto of our studio, so I thought we would put it in. So I'll show you some slides of my jewelry, which I think I tried to pick things out where you might see an influence of my culture. I tend to be, on a personal note, more minimal and more pared down, but I think in recent years I've enjoyed exploring the sort of more opulent, overabundant side of things, which doesn't come easily to me, but once you start, it kind of tumbles in. So we have a pretty wide aesthetic range in terms of simple to more opulent, if you want to call it. Also in terms of price points, we have a pretty wide range there. So the only time we use stones most are diamonds, and I didn't used to be a big fan of stones, and it's not something RISD really encouraged us to explore, so that stayed with me. But having said that, I discovered these old diamonds one time on a trip to India that are cut in these not so perfect ways, and I can't tell you how beautiful they are. So they're still diamond, they're still sparkly and beautiful, but unlike your typical diamond that has like 57 facets and it's made in a very strict environment, so it gives off as much light as possible. The older cuts, which now is sort of coming back in fashion, are much quieter and smokier, but so they still hold all the sparkle, but not the brightness, if you will. And they're coveted now, but they're not as in demand as the typical stones you see. That's a picture from a trade show we did once, and I was interested to see how we went from a much more pared down aesthetic over the years to every once in a while just going kind of full with color. That was one of the first pairs of earrings that I made. It might not be the greatest shot, but we still make, actually everything you see we still make. That was one of the first things I made when I was at RISD. This is one of my favorite necklaces that I've ever made. And the beauty of it is that the two gold leaves are actually the clasp. So it's not a particularly long necklace. It's an average size length necklace, but you can't see it. The clasp is hidden behind it. And when you wear it, you can wear it to the front, to the side, or to the back. So, it's not that I don't like simple. It's, this is not even part of my notes, but T.S. Eliot was a poet I studied a lot when I was in undergrad in New York. And he has a line that says, "A condition of complete simplicity, costing not less than everything." And the trouble with simplicity is it costs you everything in the end. But this was one of my favorite pieces where I think it really did work well. That is it. That is my last slide. Thank you. You can go back to anything if you have questions, if you want to see anything again. Mm-hmm.
So I love that those aren't perfect. Like, I'm sure that they do those more perfect from a distance, but when you have a close up like that, what influenced that?
So I think that is, what I speak of RISD because it was a very rigorous training program, even though we were undergrads. It was, and I never did anything outside of RISD in terms of more training. So when I say I make jewelry, it's exactly what I learned at RISD. You learn a little bit along the way. So RISD has a very German, very, very precise, like if we had to make a cube that was 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter, and if it was 9.99, you were not passing the class. So you could try, but it had to be exactly that. So much as I really respect that and admire it, and I love to challenge myself every once in a while, I think, if I may say, the Indian in me, where nothing is perfect in that German sense, overrides my wanting to be precise once in a while. And I've learned to work with it. I like to work with the imprecision and see how that can still make it into a finished piece without looking sloppy. So I asked a teacher of mine if she would be here, but she was busy today. So I had a teacher when I was a sophomore, and we were working on a project, and I was really tired, and we had to make a clasp. And making a clasp on a necklace is kind of a difficult thing, and to get it just right is not easy. So I put a clasp on it the day before my final exam, and I thought it was, pretty good. It went with everything. I could have pulled it off, but she said, "Oh, come on, Priya, you can do better than this." And I said, "It's due tomorrow." And she's like, "I think you can do like one step better." And I did. I stayed up all night and I made a class that was like perfect for the piece. And I tease my teacher, Noam, that to this day in the studio, if I'm working and I'm trying to like hustle through something or rush, I hear this little voice saying, no, like you can't do it that way. So I love imprecision and I love that slightly not perfect look, but thanks to Rizzy, the craftsmanship is really still spot on. Like I cannot let go of that, her voice in my head saying.
I got a question. Several years ago, they mailed catalogs and also in the media, there's a lot of talk about the man-made diamonds, very comparable to the real diamonds set in gold and silver rings. And now, the last 7, 8, 9, 10 years now, it seems like the real diamond business is trying to stifle those man-made diamonds. And is that because they want to increase their own business rather than lose business with the man-made diamonds? And could you just elaborate on what you know about this? What do you know about this?
So De Beers is the longest standing monopoly in the world still. Most people don't realize it. They hold, I don't know the percentage, but the vast majority of the world's diamonds still. They have maintained under the radar presence, and for some reason they haven't been broken up. It is a very artificial market. I mean, all of precious jewelry is an artificial market, but the diamond industry is not only cutthroat, but it's always been ridiculous. And the markets, like most people have no input in the price of anything. It's dictated on a daily basis worldwide, and then the prices fluctuate accordingly. So the crazy thing I tell my interns is that the diamond industry, as far as I know, is one of the weirdest ones. Something microscopic that you can't even really see determines the price from, let's say, $1,000 a carat to $15,000 a carat, which you can't even see with a naked eye. And that's just how the industry is. So anyway, it's in De Beers' interest to keep the market very close to home and tight. But there's a lot of new materials that people have come up with, nothing it is a natural material, diamonds, and you can't make it in exactly the same way. But I've seen diamonds that I can't even tell the difference if they're real or fake. They're that good. And, in some way, I don't have a problem with it, because if it means less mining, or if somebody can't afford a $30,000 diamond, but still wants the joy of something that looks like that, I say, why not? Sure. Having said that, we don't tend to use them much, but, I'm.
Yeah, could you show that table again you have for rings?
Yeah. This one?
Yeah, just talk about it.
So most of these, actually this ring here, this is what started the whole project. So what happened was my parents had bought me an old pair of earrings in Venice that when I was a teenager. And I think up until then, as teenagers are wont to do, I couldn't stand anything precious or, nothing fancy. And India, which has a great tradition of jewelry, I don't think I ever really looked at jewelry, in a positive light growing up, one way or the other. But I remember when I got those earrings, I was blown away because they were diamonds, and I had sort of imagined that I wouldn't like diamonds ever. And it opened a whole new world for me. So these are old rose cuts, and there's other cuts that are similar to that 15 years ago were almost impossible to find. Like I said, now there's a little bit of a resurgence in older cuts that people enjoy. And so what started was when I had a pair of earrings made out of those, I realized I really did love those stones. And it was not easy to find, and it still isn't easy to find rose cut diamonds because they're not in demand, and you can't say, like in a typical, it's very unglamorous. In a typical jewelry world, if somebody said I want a 2-carat diamond ring, I would open a catalog. It's a little spreadsheet, and you say, okay, either you go by budget or you go by size. And I say, okay, I want a 3-carat ring or a 1-carat ring and this, and you call and you order it. These, you can't do that.
They're a form of diamond.
Say that again?
They're a form of diamond.
They are diamonds.
They are diamonds.
They are diamonds. So the difference is they're exactly, a diamond is a diamond. It just depends on the size and inclusions, which is what's inside the diamond that makes it not perfect. So D color without any flaws is like a perfect diamond, right? So these mostly have inclusions. They're darker, so the color is not as bright as you would. So I think the reason they're not in demand is most people like what Louis Tiffany perfected, which is 57 facets, and even tiny diamonds now all try to simulate that one cut, which is known as a Tiffany cut, which became, through marketing, the most popular cut ever. It reigned supreme for many decades almost, and it still does. But as far as all trends go, there's been a resurgence in older cuts, like there's mine cut, rose cuts. They're just not as easy to find because when a diamond cutter gets a stash of diamonds, the demand is always going to be greater for your average cuts than these. So it's harder to, and as the size grows bigger, it's most cutters don't save the rose cuts for people like me to buy, because if they cut it in a typical 57 facets, it would sell faster.
What materials do you use from India, or do you?
I buy a lot of my stones there that are not so easy to find, and I have some of these are set in a more traditional Indian way that I can't do here, but I primarily work in silver and gold. So there's a distinction in the jewelry industry. There's costume jewelry, which actually Rhode Island was the costume capital in the world. And I still know people, for instance, that come from India to do business in Rhode Island, even though the industry as a general is nothing compared to what it was 30 years ago or 50 years ago, but there's still, so we get a free pass because anything that I need to do as a jeweler compared to a friend of mine in, let's say, San Francisco or any other part of the country, we have access to all of the costume jewelry industry, the factories that still exist or service, like stone setters. Again, a small fraction of what it used to be 30 years ago, but it's very easy to run a jewelry business here.
How many factories do you say left making costume jewelry around?
Not many. Compared to its heyday, I would say 10%. Don't quote me on that. I'm not.
Does that mean 3 or 20?
No, there's smaller factories that do different types of work. There's a lot of like chain makers, platers, and it is still one of the best places. Like I said, people come from the rest of the world to get things done here, and some of the local factories have very big accounts. Like Tiffany has a factory that they opened in Cumberland, partly because there's a lot of jewelry knowledge in the area.
I'm seeing a lot of natural forms in your jewelry. Can you comment a little bit on your appreciation for plants, flowers, gardens? Any connection to your work?
People ask me that. I see it, but I don't. It just is me, I suppose. Like I said, a part of me really does like the very a stricter aesthetic, but I don't know, maybe I grew up around, or maybe it's a cop-out because you don't have to be so precise when you're, I think for me, when I make jewelry, which is not always certainly not how other people think of it, I don't wear 98% of what I make, but I tend to think of it as something that does go on the body. There's a whole, and I keep mentioning RISD because it's so informed me, and it has a very good department in jewelry. There's more studio jewelry, which is what we were sort of trained in at RISD, which was less organic, if you will, and certainly less wearer friendly. And not that there's anything wrong with it, but I think in the sense that I have a hard time relating, like I probably wouldn't go out to dinner wearing a brooch that big. Again, it's a beautiful brooch. I have a teacher who made one. It's amazing. These forms speak to me probably more than a much more strict or stricter aesthetic. And I do love plants. Yeah.
So it looks like a lot of yours is custom. Do people bring you designs and say, I want 300 of these in this style or something that you already made?
So anytime somebody asks us to do custom, which is usually not a mass production. I mean, once in a while, actually, no, not really. So when I say, yes, I might consider doing custom work, one of the things I say is if it's within my scope and aesthetic technically and something that I would enjoy making, absolutely. But for instance, one time I had a gentleman who asked me if I made a skull, if I could make a skull studded with diamonds, kind of not my wheelhouse. And, you know, I wouldn't take that on because it's not that I couldn't make it, but I don't think I would enjoy making it. The other problem is, RISD seemed to overlook it. I can't draw. I'm like the only student that ever went to RISD that cannot. And when people say, oh, you must be able to, know, I cannot draw. I don't have a sketchbook. And so if people need, and so anytime somebody asks me for custom jewelry, I have this like spiel of what I can't do. I can't show them drawings unless I, hire somebody to do it. So if they say, I want a ring that looks, this ring of yours, but I want that shank, the rest is up to God. Like, yes, I'll make it, but I can't do much else. And it's strangely, it works. I mean, we do custom work, but.
Before you leave this slide, you said that some of these are more Indian in design, I think is what you were saying. Can you point those out?
So like this setting, for instance, this one is a very traditional Indian setting. This one is this one right here, and that one. And what I mean by that is, and there's hundreds of different types of settings, but so diamonds were actually first used, and I don't know, discovered, but certainly in terms of jewelry, they were first used in India in the Mughal era, about 600 years ago. The rest of the world did not actually care about diamonds. It was not an industry, it was not something that people cared for in terms of jewelry, because, so diamond is also the hardest substance known to man. Actually, a little fact I will say, 24 karat gold, I love this little bit of information, is the same hardness as the human nail. So anything that you can do to nail, pure gold or 24 karat gold is that soft, right? So diamond, on the other hand, is the hardest substance on the Mohs scale known to man. So what happened was when diamonds were sort of discovered and mined, people didn't know 600 years ago what to do with them, or how many ever years ago. So as a result, part of the reason diamonds were cut in a more, I don't like to say crude, but for lack of a better word, crude manner, is because nobody knew how to do it. We didn't have the technology. That really only started about 100 years ago, maybe 150 years ago. So when they set stones, and this is getting very technical, when I keep mentioning the 57 facets, what that does is, it's like that typical shape of a diamond. It makes the diamond brighter, right? It's the refraction of the light makes it such that it looks whiter. So a rose cut diamond looks like a dark pebble almost. It's not opaque, and depending on the inclusions, it's definitely transparent. You can tell it's a sparkling diamond, but it's darker. As a result, in India, which is the first culture that sort of liked diamonds and wanted to wear them as jewelry, a lot of Indian jewelry, you'll see, they put the diamond themselves look like pieces of glass because they don't have the technology, and they continue to not do that because they like it this way. So pieces like this and that and that and that, when I say they're Indian tradition, they put a silver foil behind it, and the whiteness that you see, so you won't see that in this, for instance, if you saw the actual ring in person, it's transparent. It's an open back setting. The other ones that I pointed out are closed back. And what they did, or they figured they would do, is if this is a diamond that is not inherently that bright looking, if you put a silver lining on the underside of the diamond, it looks brighter. So a lot of which that is not something I can do. It would take me a lifetime to learn how to do that. So a lot of those types of settings, I have to have a stone setter set them in India, because I don't know how to do that. It's a very old technique how they do it. So it's very different from your normal diamond. And I don't think there's anyone here I've ever found who knows how to do that.
Since you talked about the Indian influence, I wanted to come back to the influence that we call German at RISD, which of course is interesting to me. And I wonder if we could go back to your favorite piece, which was that very, very simple set of two leaves.
Yeah.
For instance, this one here. Is that a response to the German influence at RISD, or is that still something else? Or how would you define that sort of German way of doing
I probably would have gotten an A if I did do this in RISD, but which is not to say that they discouraged other, it has a very robust tradition of encouraging alternate materials, but the techniques that they use, which is similar to other parts of the world, is very German. And when I say that they're German, a lot of their teachers in the last 30 years were from Germany, and a lot of their visiting professors. So Germany has its own very robust jewelry tradition. And for whatever reason, RISD has had this symbiotic relationship. It sort of just continued on in that way. It could have just as easily been Italian or, Spanish, and all of those cultures are slightly different. The techniques in terms of the actual making is pretty universal all over the world, but the aesthetic that RISD sort of, I don't even think they encourage it. It's a fabric of the department now, is a more German aesthetic. And at least when we start out learning, there's, that's not when they say, oh, your 1-inch cube can be slightly bent and 9.5 because you're from India. Like, no, you have to learn to do it the right way, which I really value, because I think if it weren't for that strictness, I don't know, I can't go back in time. Like maybe I would have been sloppy or, and I don't mean to also insinuate that Indian jewelry or other cultures is sloppy. It's a whole different aesthetic. So it works within that culture, and there's different settings, and there's different, like if you saw one of these, like what Susan had mentioned, we could have made these a perfect star, but then it's just not what it's supposed to be. So I think as long as it worked at RISD, they were always happy to encourage any, but I don't know if I mentioned this before, but one of the good things about RISD is that what I think any good school, any education should do is it taught you how to think critically very well, at least for me. And it sort of built in me a conscience that I carry with me. And I'm very grateful for that I haven't lost it and I don't want to. I wish all disciplines could do that, to keep that alive in you so that you don't lose it as time goes by. Yep.
You mentioned interns a couple of times. What do you encourage in your interns/students?
So no intern of mine ever picks up dry cleaning or laundry or anything like that. I've had probably almost 100 interns by now since I started, or 75 at least. I have interns from RISD, but from some of the neighboring schools as well. It is very intensely focused on bench work. So they show up, and I have this spiel that I've been giving for years, but I try to work with them in terms of what their skill level is. I prefer to get seniors, or not so many grad students, but at least seniors if I can. We try to see what they're good at, and I kind of say, like, this is not your time to explore something that you're not interested in or good at for the 3 months that you're here. That's what school is for. This is for them to get an overall sense of what we're doing, ask questions, and learn, and try to see a different pace from what school teaches you. It's sort of the yin and the yang. If I did exactly what school was teaching them, then I don't think they would be that interested in being there.
An interesting question is, when you were talking about your history from India when you moved there, did you learn English in India before you came here, or you already knew how to speak English and understand the language then?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's noticeable because you talk like a native American.
If
So,
my mom calls now, you'd never think I lived in the US,
yeah,
though.
if you didn't tell anybody, they wouldn't know. But some people don't, they immigrate and say like 15 or 17, and you notice that they don't speak as well as you do.
Thank you. Most Indian urban kids, which is kind of a tragic thing, as long as they do both, it's fine. But most Indian kids, my generation going forward, we all speak English. That's my first language. Which is not to say I can't speak other languages, but it is my first language.
I wanted to, before we close and move on to more intimate conversation and wine, I wanted to ask you, you came to New York, and obviously you weren't thinking about craft with your hands, you were thinking of philosophy and photography. But of course you come from a family of several generations in textile business, so you were actually surrounded by, I imagine, questions about craft and art and color and fashion and putting things together and
Yep.
Indian history. And I wonder if somehow when you left New York and you came to RISD, this sort of connection was reestablished, or
Probably.
you made that transition to.
So my father, so an interesting thing is when we do trade shows, which is, and I mention them only because the entire collection is out, which is not out most other times. I have never done a trade show where somebody hasn't walked by and said, wow, there's like a textile feeling in your jewelry. And my father has always like wagged his finger and said, you can run, but you can't hide. And it's true. So clearly there's something that I picked up from dinner table conversation with my family that stays with me. So.
Before I thank Priya, I wanted to thank Reese and Bridget, who Reese greeted at the door, and Bridget has set up wine and food outside and has prepared everything else and created a list and so on. She's also putting talk online, and so we can been really helpful in our series. But mostly I want to thank Priya
Thank
for
you.
this really wonderful and enlightening talk about this cultural cross pollination in a way that is very visible in your work.
Thank you.
It's really quite wonderful. So thank you
It's
very
fun.
much.
Thank you.